Notes and tricks. Learn faster. Score higher.
Marathi first before ever writing them down in English. So we're going to teach this conceptually, bridging those language gaps to make sure everything is just crystal clear. I want you to treat this as your ultimate study session. So sit up straight, clear out any distractions, and let's master these biological systems together. So let's start with a really fundamental question. Basically, how do we actually tell the difference between what's alive and what's, well, not? If you see a dog running around or a cow chewing grass, sure, it's easy. But what if they're fast asleep? Or what about plants? See, the common trap is just looking for visible movement. But visible movement is nowhere near enough to define life. To truly figure out what's alive, we have to zoom way in. We have to look at the microscopic level, the invisible continuous movements of molecules happening deep inside the cells. Literally, if those invisible molecular movements stop, life stops. Okay, here's our game plan for today. We'll kick things off with what our life process is, then move on to plant and animal nutrition, trace the human digestive system, explore respiration and energy, cover transportation and organisms, and finally wrap it all up with an exam review and homework.
Right, let's dive straight into Section 1. What are life processes?
Think about it this way. Living organisms are incredibly highly organized, ordered structures. But because of the environment, this order is constantly at risk of breaking down entirely. So, living creatures have to continuously repair and maintain themselves. Basically, ये एक continuous maintenance job है. Even when you're just sitting there or fast asleep in your bed doing nothing, your body is working overtime, constantly moving molecules around to prevent damage. All these processes that group together to perform this vital maintenance job, that is exactly what we call life processes.
Moving right along to Section 2. Plant and animal nutrition.
So I need you to flag this concept right now because ha खूप महत्वाचा topic आहे. It's a massive exam topic. You absolutely must be able to contrast autotrophic and heterotrophic nutrition perfectly. Autotrophs, like green plants, use super simple inorganic sources. We're talking carbon dioxide and water to literally build their own food. Heterotrophs, like us humans and other animals, well, we can't do that. We rely entirely on consuming complex substances. But our bodies can't just use that complex food directly. We actually have to break it down into simpler forms, and we do this using specialized biocatalysts called enzymes. Keep that word in your head, enzymes. Let's zoom in on those autotrophs for a second. Photosynthesis is basically the magic process where autotrophs take in carbon dioxide and water and completely convert them into carbohydrates using sunlight and chlorophyll. And these carbohydrates are what actually provide energy to the plants. Now, here's a golden nugget for your exam. Plants do not use all those carbohydrates immediately. They store the extra energy away as starch. Humans, on the other hand, we store our extra energy in a totally different form called glycogen. Whatever you do, do not mix those two up on test day.
Now what's really fascinating is the mechanical structure making this gas exchange possible. Think about the tiny pores on the surface of a leaf. Those are the stomata. Massive, and I mean massive amounts of gaseous exchange take place through these microscopic pores. But how do they know when to open and close? It's all controlled by the guard cells. जब पानी guard cells में भरता है, they swell right up and the pore opens. When they shrink down, the pore closes tightly to prevent the plant from losing unnecessary water. It's just an incredibly elegant system.
Okay, moving on to Section 3, the human digestive system. Let's look at how we as heterotrophs process our complex food. The human alimentary canal is essentially one long continuous tube from the mouth all the way to the anus. But here's a super fascinating fact that exam boards absolutely love to test. The actual length of the small intestine differs between animals based entirely on their diet. Herbivores that graze on grass have a much longer small intestine because the cellulose in plants is incredibly tough to digest. Carnivores, the meat eaters, have a shorter small intestine because meat is actually a lot easier to break down. All right, so the absolutely crucial thing to know for the exam is how to trace the path of food and know exactly what's happening at every single step. It kicks off in the mouth, where an enzyme called salivary amylase immediately starts breaking down complex starch into simple sugars. Then, the food gets pushed down the esophagus through these rhythmic muscular contractions called peristalsis. Next stop, the stomach. Here, gastric glands release hydrochloric acid and a protein-digesting enzyme called pepsin. The acid creates the perfect, highly acidic environment for that pepsin to go to work. Finally, the food moves into the highly coiled small intestine, which is where the final digestion and absorption actually happen. Which brings us to section 4, respiration and energy. Let's see how our cells actually extract the energy locked in that digested food. Because this is another heavily tested topic, so pay very close attention. There are two main pathways our cells use to break down food for energy. First, aerobic respiration. This takes place in the presence of oxygen, specifically inside the mitochondria of the cell, and man, it releases a massive amount of energy. Then you have anaerobic respiration, which happens in the absence of oxygen. Sometimes, like when you're doing sudden, incredibly heavy exercise, your muscle cells actually run out of oxygen, so they switch to an anaerobic pathway, converting energy but producing lactic acid as a byproduct. You know that sudden buildup of lactic acid? That is exactly what causes those painful muscle cramps. To pull off that high-energy aerobic respiration, our bodies need a ridiculously efficient system to get oxygen into our bloodstream. Air gets filtered by fine hairs in our nostrils first. Then it travels all the way down into our lungs to millions of tiny balloon-like structures called alveoli. These alveoli create this massive, massive surface area for gas exchange. But here's the catch. Diffusion alone just isn't fast enough. So, our red blood cells use a specialized respiratory pigment called hemoglobin. Hemoglobin has a super high affinity for oxygen, so it essentially grabs it and carries it to literally every single cell in your body.
All right, let's jump straight into section 5, transportation in organisms.
When it comes down to it, size literally matters for transportation. Lahan vanaspati, or simple terrestrial plants, can just absorb raw materials directly from the soil using their roots. And if the plant is tiny, those materials can just naturally diffuse right up to the leaves. But for large animals like us, our body design is way too complex. Simple diffusion pressure simply cannot deliver oxygen and nutrients fast enough to all our distant tissues. And that right there is exactly why we evolved a complex circulatory system with a pumping heart and carrier molecules like the hemoglobin we were just talking about. Okay, class, put your pens down for a second, take a deep breath, and focus. We're in section 6, exam review and homework. Let's lock in the absolute core takeaways from this entire chapter. Remember, invisible molecular movement is your true indicator of life. To prevent structural breakdown, life demands continuous maintenance, and that means nutrition, respiration, transport, and excretion. You absolutely have to know the difference between autotrophs that synthesize their own food and heterotrophs that consume it. Oh, and here's a universal fact you really must remember. In all organisms, whether they are aerobic or anaerobic, the universal first step of cellular energy production is breaking down glucose, a 6-carbon molecule, into a 3-carbon molecule called pyruvate right inside the cytoplasm. Do not forget that step. Now, let's apply exactly what we just learned. We're going to solve textbook question number 8 together right now, just to prep you for how you should be structuring your answers on the actual board exam. The question is, what are the differences between aerobic and anaerobic respiration? If you're ever asked to find the difference between two things, a clear table is absolutely the way to go. As I always emphasize for absolute clarity, the defining difference is oxygen gahona ya nahona, literally, the presence versus the absence of oxygen. Aerobic requires oxygen, anaerobic does not. Aerobic happens largely in the mitochondria, anaerobic happens in the cytoplasm or in yeast. Aerobic yields a very high amount of energy, anaerobic yields a low amount. And finally, aerobic end products are carbon dioxide and water, while anaerobic produces either ethanol and carbon dioxide, or, like we learned with those muscle cramps, lactic acid. Seriously, study this table until you can draw it entirely from memory. Before we wrap up today, I need you to write down these 2 direct questions from your textbook. This is your mandatory homework assignment. Question 1, what is the role of saliva in digestion? Question 2, what are the necessary conditions for autotrophic nutrition? I expect every single one of you to use the structured concepts from today's explainer, so think about enzymes and specific required inputs to answer them perfectly. No skipping the homework if you want to score top marks. I want to leave you with one final kind of provocative thought. Your textbook states, if order breaks down, the organism will no longer be alive. We've spent this entire session looking at the microscopic stuff, stoma, enzymes, alveoli, mitochondria. But what happens to our global macro environment, our entire ecosystem, if just one of these tiny microscopic processes fails on a mass scale? Literally everything is connected. Keep studying hard, keep asking those big questions, and I'll see you all in the next explainer.